You are listening to 106.7, Wilmington's Big Talker, and my name is Paul Vallone. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Sunday at 5 p.m., as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of people from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. For the main part of our show today, we will discuss what may be the most important development on the gun rights scene since the Supreme Court affirmed an individual right to arms in the seminal case D.C. v. Heller, namely the retirement of Supreme Court Associate Justice Anthony Kennedy and President Donald Trump's appointment of his successor. Rest assured, folks, that the left will come truly unhinged. We've seen that in recent months. It will be more true than ever. This is war, and you will need to be ready. I'm happy to say that for that segment, we will be featuring our guest, Professor Greg Wallace, a constitutional law professor at Campbell University, who is widely published, including up to and including The Hill. But first, let's talk about the North Carolina Republican Party and how it is treating gun rights supporters. You may recall that in the Republican Revolution of 1994, and in the hanging Chad debacle of 2000, the 2000 presidential elections, and in 2016, not to mention innumerable smaller races, gun voters have largely been responsible for Republican gains. On prom night, as they say, it was you who brung 'em to the dance. Now the question is, have they forgotten who brung 'em to the dance? For their own part, Republicans actively pander to the gun vote, telling gun voters at every opportunity that they, not the Democrats, are the friends of gun owners. Unfortunately, however, there is a certain inertia that develops when a political power assumes and retains power. The bottom line is that politicians love power. The easiest way to stay in power is not to tick anybody off. And the easiest way not to tick anybody off is to not actually do anything. And that seems to be what has happened to the North Carolina Republican Party. Republicans now have two pro-gun bills tied up in committee with the apparent intention of ignoring them until dead by denying them committee hearings. HB 746 would dramatically expand concealed carry throughout the state and passed in the North Carolina House, but now languishes in the Senate, denied a hearing by Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger. Similarly, HB 1039 would protect school children from active shooters by allowing selected volunteer faculty members who have concealed handgun permits and who receive additional training to carry concealed firearms. Yet, North Carolina House Speaker Tim Moore has said the bill will never get a committee hearing. Meanwhile, North Carolina GOP Executive Director Dallas Woodhouse has gone onto Facebook to tell supporters that no gun bills will receive hearings this year because this is an election year. Now, it would be one thing if this was simply a difference in tactics. If Republicans honestly said, not this year, but we promise to run it next year, although I have heard that far too often, I wouldn't agree with that approach, but one could at least chalk it off to an honest difference of opinion. Unfortunately, however, that isn't how Republican leadership is dealing with the issue. Nope, instead, they're figuring you are stupid. You're just a bunch of rubes that they can fool. Hence, their next two maneuvers. First, they held a lovely gala for the Second Amendment at the GOP state convention in Hickory. Yes, you heard it right. A gala, whatever that is, held for the Second Amendment by people who won't lift a finger for the Second Amendment. Oh, and this caused a certain amount of consternation among the party faithful, especially when those ostensible Second Amendment supporters held their gala at a location which was posted against firearms. But that isn't all. That isn't even the worst of it. Because they have judged you to be truly stupid, they decided to do something for you, or at least do something that looks like they're doing something for you. So Senator Berger apparently recruited his minions to run a bill for a ballot initiative to add a right to hunting and fishing to the North Carolina Constitution. Yes, hunting and fishing. That doesn't protect children from violent sociopaths, of course, unless I suppose you want to fend them off with a fishing pole. Beyond the fact that empty hunting and fishing amendments won't do anything to deter violent crime, however, you're supposed to ignore that hunting and fishing aren't under any particular attack. And in particular, never mind that the Second Amendment, as the intended last layer in a series of checks and balances against abuse of government, has absolutely nothing to do with hunting and fishing. Nope, according to Berger, Moore, and Woodhouse, you should be happy with their empty gesture because, after all, they held a gala for the Second Amendment. Oh, and I neglected to mention the last little joke they played on you. What they portray as a gesture for you is actually a cynical ploy to benefit them. Why? Because by putting something on the ballot, which will induce conservatives who might otherwise not bother to vote to actually go to the polls, they benefit, wait for it, Republicans. They're going to get more conservatives to go to the polls and vote Republican with this ballot initiative. Votes, money, and power are what make politicians tick, and unfortunately, unless you can make them understand that you are the source of votes, money, and power, or the absence thereof, they will ignore you. Accordingly, I'm going to put in a little plug here and ask you to contribute to the one entity in North Carolina which truly represents gun owners, the Grassroots North Carolina Political Victory Fund, or GRNC-PVF. The GRNC Political Victory Fund is our federally registered political action committee and is the tool we use to throw out anti-gun politicians and elect true statesmen. I'm asking you to please go to grnc.org and click on the GRNC PVF tab at the top of the home page. Again, that's go to grnc.org, and at the top of the page, click on GRNC PVF and contribute to the Political Action Committee. You will find there. This is the only entity in North Carolina truly defending your gun rights. We're going to take a break. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. After we return, we will speak with our guest, law professor Greg Wallace, and his take on the implications of the retirement of Associate Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy on the Second Amendment. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. Today, our topic is the pending retirement of Associate Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy and its potential impact on how the High Court deals with gun rights cases. We are fortunate to have as our guest Campbell University Law School professor Greg Wallace, who teaches constitutional law with an emphasis on free speech, church and state, right to arms, and constitutional interpretation. Providing frequent commentary on constitutional issues at conferences and symposia, as well as in news reports, talk radio, and op-ed columns, Professor Wallace is a regular contributor to thehill.com. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
Well, first, I'd like to take a moment to gloat, specifically with an op-ed in the Orlando Sentinel, which was titled, "Congrats, Trump Voters, You've Been Vindicated." I'm gloating because that is precisely the point I made to the never-Trumpers prior to the 2016 elections. I was not a big Donald Trump fan to begin with either, but I kept insisting that if Hillary Clinton got the chance to make a Supreme Court appointment, our republic as we know it is over. Well, hard on the heels of what is, by all accounts, the highly successful nomination of Neil Gorsuch, Trump gets yet another chance as Associate Justice Anthony Kennedy announces his pending retirement. I think you too would probably regard this as an opportunity to get some originalists into the Supreme Court. Would you not agree?
I would agree wholeheartedly. Justice Kennedy has notoriously been the swing vote on the court for a number of years. He has sided with the liberal wing of the court on abortion rights. He has sided with that wing of the court on gay marriage. In fact, I think he's sort of fashioned himself as the Thurgood Marshall of gay rights, writing all four Supreme Court decisions involving gays and gay marriage. He also has advocated a very open-ended kind of constitutional rights jurisprudence that goes way beyond the rights that are enumerated in the Constitution and sort of opens the door up for all sorts of rights that pertain to autonomy and dignity. Very hard to draw lines when you're dealing with concepts as amorphous as that. So most Supreme Court litigators will tell you that they would make their arguments toward one justice, and that would be Justice Kennedy. So his departure from the court gives President Trump an opportunity to swing the court back toward more of the originalist side, that is, justices who view the Constitution as a document, the meaning of which is to be understood as it was originally understood when written and adopted, not the meaning that justices simply want to give it, today.
All right, so it's fair to say then that Justice Kennedy was never the conservatives' best friend. How specifically on our issue for the Second Amendment, how did Kennedy come down in the two seminal decisions, namely, of course, the Heller and the McDonald decisions? Where was he on those?
He was with the conservative majority on those cases. So Justice Kennedy made up he was one of the 5 justices that voted to in the court's landmark decision in District of Columbia versus Heller, in which the court held that the Second Amendment protects the individual right to keep and bear arms for self-defense, whether against a tyrannical government or common criminal. He also was one of the 5 justices who voted in the McDonald case to apply the Second Amendment through the Due Process Clause through to state and local governments. So without his vote in both of those cases, we would not be where we are today, at least in terms of the Supreme Court decisions on the Second Amendment.
All right. So we are definitely going to need another pro-gun voter, if you will, which probably one would presume would be a safe bet from a Trump appointment. But I guess we'll look at that a little bit more later. Now, we've seen the case in any number of cases recently. We have seen the Supreme Court decline to take Second Amendment cases beyond the Heller and McDonald decisions, which I believe has caused Clarence Thomas some measure of consternation or frustration. Matter of fact, in a blog at reason.com that I'm sure you're familiar with, the Wallace conspiracy, I saw conjecture that the court refused several Second Amendment cases because, frankly, they didn't know how Kennedy would rule. How do you think this might impact, I guess, the Supreme Court's willingness to deal with Second Amendment issues?
Well, 3 days ago, I'm sure you remember, we marked the 10th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in the Heller case. Since Heller, the constitutional right to keep and bear arms is still largely illusory. Lower state and federal courts, with very few exceptions, have confined the right to arms to sort of a constitutional halfway house by bowing in the direction of its existence but not seriously enforcing it. And they've really treated Heller as not as precedent to be followed, but a decision to be ignored or avoided before approving almost any law restricting the right to arms. The Supreme Court has refused to take a large number of cases that the Second Amendment rights advocates in those cases have asked the court to hear, with the hopes of overturning some of these lower federal court decisions. But the Supreme Court has pretty much gone quiet on gun rights since Heller and McDonald. Now, there was only one Supreme Court decision since those 2 cases, and that was the Caetano decision upholding holding that stun guns are protected by the Second Amendment. But that's it. Now, left undecided are very important questions about, number one, the extent of the right to bear arms outside the home. You had a number of the federal appellate courts upholding the efforts of states to put strict conditions on carry permits, or some, like in California, you can hardly, that deny public carry altogether. And then second, also the nature and type of the weapons that have been protected under the Second Amendment. Just last year, the Fourth Circuit, in a decision that was riddled with legal and factual errors, held that these so-called assault weapons are not protected by the Second Amendment. Now, many believe, as you said, that the Supreme Court has gone quiet on gun rights because either Justice Kennedy or Chief Justice Roberts, or perhaps both, have sort of gone soft on the Second Amendment. I think it's more likely that Justice Kennedy would be the one to do this because he has gone back and forth on the liberal and conservative sides of the court quite often during his tenure. So I think with him gone now, I think it's the opportunity for Trump to appoint somebody who's very strong on Second Amendment rights.
All right. So then what could gun rights supporters expect to see if we got a true originalist into the Supreme Court in Kennedy's stead? What do you think we might see from here?
Well, I think we can expect to look for the court to offer greater clarity on the Second Amendment. For example, if a more originalist court follows Justice Scalia's reasoning in Heller, that the Second Amendment protects weapons in common use for lawful purposes, then I think these broad assault weapons bans are going to fail. I also think the court can bring greater clarity to the actual scope of the Second Amendment right outside the home. Remember, Heller dealt only with the possession of a weapon inside the home. So I think the court could emphasize that the right to keep arms is also the right to bear arms, to carry arms outside the home.
All right. Okay. All right. At this point, I think is a good place to take a break. So, folks who are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Please join us after the break as we resume our discussion of the potential implications of the retirement of Associate Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. And we'll be hearing more from law professor Greg Wallace. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com, sponsored by Hyatt Gun Shop, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. We are speaking with constitutional law professor of Campbell University, Greg Wallace, and his take on the pending retirement of Associate Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy with respect to gun rights. Okay, Greg, there were a couple of things. We ran out of time, and there was a couple more things you wanted to cover on what gun rights supporters might expect from a new court after Trump's appointment. Please continue.
Yeah, I think after Kennedy leaves the court and we get a new justice appointed there, that there is going to be more likely that the Supreme Court is going to take some of these cases from the lower courts. I can't stress enough how disastrous these lower court cases have been for gun rights. Almost universally, the federal appellate courts have not taken Heller seriously. They've ignored it. They don't accept Heller, so they try to find ways around it or to distinguish it. So the Supreme Court really needs to step in to reinvigorate the Second Amendment in the federal court system. And I think you're much more likely to have that happen with a Trump appointee who's very solid on Second Amendment, which I expect he would appoint somebody like that. But I think that at least takes Kennedy out of, and as I said earlier, either Kennedy or Roberts or both perhaps have gone a little soft, but that still gives a much better step in the right direction for this. You've had some of these lower court decisions that have been have affirmed very highly restrictive carry requirements. They have affirmed, there have been 4 federal appellate court decisions that have affirmed assault weapon bans, and without a peep from the Supreme Court. And I think we are overdue for some Supreme Court clarity on this, and I think we have moved a huge step closer to that with somebody other than Justice Kennedy being on the court.
Yeah, as I recall, when I attended your excellent Second Amendment symposium at Campbell University, several of your speakers, noted and renowned people, referred to this as the second, the second-class right or something along those lines, I think?
Yes, and Justice Thomas has even called it that. I would not even. I think second class is doing it more service than the lower courts have given it. I think they don't even consider it a right at all because they have upheld so many of these restrictions. And let me say something just about the assault weapons ban. These are extremely important cases, and the AR-15 is the best-selling rifle in the United States. There are probably 15 million of them out there in the.
I know I got a bunch
American
of them.
Citizens. Yeah, I do too. But what happens is that these assault weapon bans are very important because, as you well know, Paul, the anti-gun crowd moves incrementally. And now that you've had a number of these lower federal courts uphold assault weapons bans, then you're going to get two things. Number one, you're going to get more jurisdictions adopting assault weapons bans. And that includes perhaps North Carolina if the voters of North Carolina return the Democrats to power in the state legislature. Because under that Fourth Circuit decision, assault weapons are not protected under the Second Amendment, so they can ban them without any.
You just sent a
amendment.
major shudder through me. I want you to know that, with the Democrats controlling the process here again. Anyways, go on.
Well, the other thing is that once they've been successful in banning assault weapons, is they're going to start expanding their the scope of what they're asking for. I know you have seen, like I have, calls now for banning all semi-automatic weapons, which would include semi-automatic handguns as well as semi-automatic rifles.
Oh yeah. As you say, they're taking an incremental approach. They'll get whatever they can get. Now, moving on a little bit to, we've talked about Kennedy's replacement and what impact that might have on the decisions. Let's talk a little bit about the confirmation process. It's no secret that we are embroiled in the great culture war, with some saying we could eventually end up in a civil war, although it's anything but civil, with the political left now screaming for completely open borders, repealing the Second Amendment, abolishing ICE, and far, far more. The left has become increasingly anti-law enforcement. Gallup now notes a 64-point gap between Republicans and Democrats on their viewpoints of the NRA. One is like 23 something, and something like is like 8, and then the Republicans are 87% favorable. The Democrats only 23% favorable. Okay, we can't agree on anyone and on anything, and this one is for all the marbles. So I don't think there's much doubt that the long knives are going to be out for whomever Trump nominates. Is there anything in general that gun rights supporters who follow the debate should be alert for and perhaps ready to counter?
Well, I think, first of all, we've got to have an accurate expectation as to what we're going to see over the next several months. The left, the political left, has become unhinged for the most part by Donald Trump's presidency. And I will have to say that he's usually pretty good at baiting them and into demonstrating their unhingedness. But the political left,
he's got him demonstrating. He's got him actually defending MS-13.
Yeah, I know it. I mean, he's got him defending him. Yes, defending MS-13. It's just crazy how unhinged and just how mean-spirited the left has come. The Democrats, as the party of tolerance, aren't very tolerant. So what we're going to see over the next several months is World War III in Washington. Okay, now this really needs to play out before the November elections. If I'm sure President Trump is planning on getting his nominee over to the Senate in the next few weeks, and then it's going to be up to Mitch McConnell in the Senate to make sure that that nominee gets confirmed before there's any chance, after the November elections, that the Democrats might take control of the Senate. If they do take control of the Senate, and again, this is why people who are concerned about gun rights need to make sure that they vote and they get politically active. If the Democrats take control of the Senate, we very well may see an 8-justice court until the end of President Trump's term, because the Democrats are going to not vote to approve any nominee that President Trump sends over there. And so that's going to be that's not going to be good in the long run. It'll keep the Supreme Court basically silent on gun rights for that period of time. Now, what is likely to happen is that thanks to the Democrats and Harry Reid's leadership, there is no longer the filibuster rule for Senate confirmations of Supreme Court justices. So what's going to happen here is that all the Republicans are going to have to stay on board with voting to confirm President Trump's nominee. And I'm a little concerned about John McCain not being there. That drops off one vote. Maybe McCain might. I don't think so, but there have been some.
I'll tell you something. Matter of fact, you have actually gotten onto some questions I had later. But yeah, continue. But with respect to McCain, I might be afraid that he would actually try and find a way to return to Washington to make that one vote against a Trump nominee. I don't know. That's John McCain for you.
Yeah, I understand. Some have called on him to resign, and let somebody appoint. Let a Republican be appointed in his stead who can give the vote in support. So we're going to see, as I said earlier, World War III in Washington D.C. over this appointment, and the Democrats are going to do everything they can to derail it because this is so important to them, and it's certainly important to Republicans as well. In fact, I was thinking the other day when everyone goes so apoplectic over a Supreme Court justice retiring, maybe that tells us that the Supreme Court has become way too important in our society.
Hallelujah.
So, I don't know.
All right, we're going to have to take a break right now. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7. We're going to take a short break, after which we will resume with a discussion of the potential impact of retirement of Supreme Court Associate Justice Anthony Kennedy on the court's interpretation of the Second. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Gun Shop, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. We are speaking with constitutional law professor of Campbell University, Greg Wallace, and his take on the pending retirement of Associate Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy with respect to gun rights. So, Greg, we're talking a little bit about the potential timing for confirmation hearings. You were talking about how important it was that we get this done before the election. So I take it you're not on board with Chuck Schumer's idea, since he says the Senate should wait until 2019 to appoint a SCOTUS pick, similar to what Mitch McConnell did in prior to the 2016 elections. So fair statement that you don't agree with that?
No, I think it's apples and oranges. There has been something of a tradition of when the opposite party controls the Senate in the last year of a president's term, that is, when they're coming up on a new election for the opposition party to hold up nominations. I think Chuck Schumer is trying to extend it out to any election year, and that just doesn't work. That there's no tradition for that. Of course, that's the way the Democrats play on these things. They don't. They say things that they hope people will not entirely understand, and in order to get some traction with their base.
Wait a minute. You're telling me that Chuck Schumer is intellectually dishonest? I'm shocked. Shocked, I tell you. All right. We've talked a little bit about the confirmation hearings. Let's talk a little bit about the confirmation picks. I guess Trump has a list of about 25 or thereabouts that Neil Gorsuch was at the top of the list, but obviously we've already taken that one. Who else looks good to you and why?
Well, there are three names on that list that would be very, very good for the Second Amendment. One is Brett Kavanaugh, who is an appellate judge on the District of Columbia Circuit Court. He was actually on the short list, what they had narrowed down to three the last time. He wrote a marvelous dissent in the Heller 2 decision, which was the decision in the D.C. Circuit after the remand from the Supreme Court in the Heller decision. He said he made a wonderful argument that the District of Columbia's assault weapon ban was unconstitutional. He also said other provisions that the that the District of Columbia had put in the intervening time also were unconstitutional. Another pick would be Thomas Hardiman. He's a judge on the Third Circuit. He wrote the decision in the Benderup case that Alan Gura litigated, which held that these felon dispossession laws can only prohibit currently dangerous persons who are likely to use firearms for illicit purposes. He also dissented in the Third Circuit's decision in Drake versus Philco, and he disagreed that gun owners have to show a justifiable need to carry a handgun. So he would be very good. And then I suspect that President Trump might just appoint a woman to this position because there are three liberal women on the side of the court, and there certainly would be nice to have a female conservative voice up there. One of the best picks there would be Diane Sykes, who's a Seventh Circuit judge. She is the strongest female judge on the in the Seventh Circuit on Second Amendment rights, perhaps the strongest female judge in the entire country on Second Amendment rights. So she would be good as well. Gun owners should be happy with if any of those are elevated to the nominee.
All right, there are three. Are there any that we should particularly avoid? I mean, and I grant you that he's probably picking conservatives, so we probably don't have any real standout sore thumbs. But we all know that some candidates can be surprising. Roberts being a classic example, I guess. Are there any that you have, I guess, mixed feelings about?
Not at this time, and I think that part of the problem is that some of these judges have not had occasion to rule on Second Amendment issues, so you really don't know where they're going to go. Now, you've got other possibilities like Mike Lee, who's a senator. He's very good on gun rights. He's not a judge, not a sitting judge, and it would kind of be good, I think, to have somebody who's not a sitting judge up there. But a lot of what Trump's decision is going to be shaped by, one is, of course, the judicial ideology, whether that's consistent with President Trump's political ideology. And Trump has been, at least verbally, a very strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and his appointment of Justice Gorsuch, I think, demonstrates that. So I don't think you're going to get somebody who's soft on the Second Amendment. But you never know. If you look back over the history of the Supreme Court, the court has had a number of Republican-appointed justices who have gone over to the middle or even gone over to the left. I think of Justice Brennan. He was one of the two justices that President Eisenhower asked. Somebody asked him, do you have any regrets about your presidency? And he says, yeah, both of them are sitting on the Supreme Court right now. And you have Justice Souter, if you remember him. You have Justice Kennedy and Justice O'Connor, who became very middle-of-the-road type justices. All of these justices were appointed by Republican presidents. So there's not just a great track record. The last time you find a Democrat, a justice appointed by a Democrat president who went to the right was all the way back to Justice Byron Whizzer White back in the 1960s. So unfortunately, Republican presidents have made some choices that have not played out well for us.
All right. Yeah, I do think, in fairness, a lot of those appointments were probably made in the 60s and 70s when I think it was before Republicans really made a move toward conservatism. Wouldn't you say? I mean, I don't regard Nixon as being a particular conservative per se. And I think this was a period of time when the Republicans were more the apologists. The vote Republican were not as bad as you think kind of attitude, where post-Reagan, I think we've had a strong conservative movement that probably is more likely to appoint candidates who are originalists rather than the centrists that some of the 60s and 70s presidents have saddled us with. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, I think so. My only concern right now is I think the only justice I have a concern about on the court right now with Justice Kennedy leaving is Chief Justice Roberts, and whether he will be a little soft on some of these individual rights. I just don't know. I'm a little concerned about that. But the other thing that I think the pressure is going to be on President Trump in this particular case to appoint a more centrist judge to get the support from the Democrats. And I think that with President Trump's track record so forth, I don't think that he's going to bow to that pressure. I think he's going to, if this appointment squeaks by one vote, I think he will be happy with it, and I would be very surprised to see him go to somebody who's maybe a soft conservative just to get support across the aisle.
And that squeaking by one vote seems to be the likely outcome of something like this, particularly if McCain is not voting. It's certainly going to be an interesting few months, particularly given the bipolar nature of American politics and how extremely polarized everything has become. So I think it's fair to say that given the impact of the Supreme Court in charting the course of the Republic for decades to come, it's safe to say that gun rights supporters are in for an interesting few months and should pay very close attention to developments. Thank you, Greg. We thank you very much for joining us and bringing us up to speed on this, which I think will be probably one of the most important issues for Second Amendment supporters and conservatives in general, perhaps of the 21st century.
Paul, I thoroughly enjoyed being with you.
It's a pleasure, sir. Meanwhile, folks, my name is Paul Vallone. You have been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, where each Sunday at 5 p.m. as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your right to keep and bear arms. Please check out our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop, at HyattGuns.com. I also encourage you to check out my site at gunspoliticsandfreedom.com. See you next week at 5.